I don't know. I haven't actually read the prison.
Tony Blair did not share the French nonchalance about Saddam, but he did want to make sure any American war was sanctioned by the UN, and he had an ally inside the administration.
Colin Powell is America's top diplomat and liaison with the rest of the world, and he knew that the United States was not going to get a lot of support if it said, we want to roll ahead. He knew, like Tony Blair, that there needed to be some greater effort.
Blair and Powell considered themselves very close allies during that entire period, and for a long time afterwards. They had the same objective, and that was to get the United Nations to participate, to make this a multinational effort.
The British were doing everything they could to bolster Powell's position. In early August, the Secretary of State made his move.
Colin Powell had arranged to have a private dinner with President Bush in the White House. Powell went in, he had notes, he spoke to the President and presented it not as just a nice thing to have other countries participate, but really as a thing that would be very important to the success of the operation.
The Hawks, led by Vice President Cheney, did not want to go to the United Nations in September, seek a new resolution. They just wanted to essentially invade Iraq immediately.
In late August, Cheney publicly declared his opposition to the return of UN inspectors to Iraq.
There's a great danger that it would provide false comfort that Saddam was somehow back in his box. What we must not do in the face of a mortal threat is to give in to wishful thinking or willful blindness.
Speeches were being made slamming the UN, and there was a lot of traffic between Downing Street and the White House saying, you can't go this far. If we're going to go down the UN route, we have to mean it.
Fearful that Bush was backtracking on his promise to go to the UN, Blair flew back to Camp David.
The purpose of our discussion today is to work out the right strategy for dealing with this, because deal with it we must.
Bush took Blair off to meet with Vice President Cheney.
The Vice President was concerned that the US not get snarled up, more time being given to Saddam playing games. Blair found it difficult to answer all the questions because he was dealing with hypotheticals, but he stuck to his guns. And in the end, the President supported him, because I think the President realized that there was no way of gaining any support in the international community unless he started off at the UN.
Bush had agreed to take Blair's route through the UN, but he exacted a high price.
By the time Bush committed to the UN route, he had obtained a private assurance from Blair that he would go to war with him pretty much no matter what.
This pledge was extremely important. I think it was important at the level of government. I think it was important to the President that he had a fellow leader in London in whom he could truly trust.
We have a shared analysis, a shared determination to deal with the issue of weapons of mass destruction, and a shared desire to deal with it on the basis of the broadest possible international support.
At each stage in this story, Blair has a little less room for maneuver. He starts off with the assumption that he really is in a position to shape a multilateral engagement against Iraq through the United Nations. He succeeded, but at a price that I don't think he anticipated, in that he himself now was forced to become much more part of the American position vis-à-vis the United Nations, vis-à-vis the critics, than he would ever have intended.
His Excellency, Mr. George W. Bush, President of the United States of America.
When Bush finally came to the UN to speak about Iraq, the mere fact that he was there brought sighs of relief across Europe.
In France, it was perceived as a political victory by Tony Blair and by Colin Powell. We had the impression that these two men were responsible, were the people who were listened to at the White House.
But the sense of victory would be short-lived. Bush was about to deliver an ultimatum, not only to Saddam, but to the UN itself.
Iraq has answered a decade of UN demands with a decade of defiance. All the world now faces a test, and the United Nations a difficult and defining moment. Are Security Council resolutions to be honored and enforced, or cast aside without consequence? Will the United Nations serve the purpose of its founding, or will it be irrelevant?
In the speech, Bush said he would go to the Security Council for a new resolution to disarm Saddam.
What Bush did not say in the speech was, we will abide by the will of the United Nations no matter what it is. He made a big point of not saying that.
Bush's words were received with dismay in Europe because what he seemed to be saying was, you can have any colour you like as long as it's red. I'll go through the UN as long as you agree with me.
Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush never really had any faith that Saddam was going to surrender. They always thought there would be war, that there would be a military solution, and their only reason for going to the UN was to get UN approval to go to war. So there was a fundamental contradiction built into this whole process.
The United States circulated a draft resolution to Security Council members. It called for weapons inspectors to re-enter Iraq and demanded that the UN authorize force if Saddam didn't disarm immediately.
It was a draft essentially dictated by the hardliners. When it was circulated, the French found it totally unacceptable.
Jacques Chirac gave an interview with the New York Times in which he suggested we should have a two-step approach. First, a resolution with some period of time to get the inspectors back, and then a short window, just a few months, to come back again and ascertain whether or not he's cooperating.
Right, Jack, why don't you start us off with the current diplomatic situation?
Asks for support.
Tony Blair had told George Bush the UN approach would work, so he set out to broker a compromise.
The view was initially that the French were just doing what the French always do, which is to resist cooperation to start with, to exact a price from the international community, and then to jump on board at the very last moment.
In late October, after weeks of negotiation, the president agreed to a watered-down resolution that gave the French some of what they wanted.
The United States agreed that it would at least go back to the Security Council for another discussion about the final act if Iraq didn't comply, and potentially a second resolution.
In a New York hotel, Colin Powell met his French counterpart, Dominique de Villepin, to fine-tune this two-stage approach.
De Villepin is a very charming political figure, and Powell really got along with him.
Powell needed to know what the French would do if the Iraqis violated the initial resolution, and America then presented a second one calling for war.
Powell turned to Villepin at dinner at the Pierre Hotel and said, just be sure of one thing. If you vote for the first, you have to be prepared to vote for the second. And Villepin said, yes, we will be. But of course they had a different view about what it was that was going to make them prepared to do so.